either to raise your hand or to put questions in the chat, and also to introduce yourself when you're asking a question. I think that's really important to know who we are discussing with. So it's important to take some time for that. Thank you so much. And Sapni, I give you the floor.
Thank you, Professor Narok. It's an absolute honor to be here. And I mean, it's really thanks a lot to Professor Rao for this invitation. And being amidst such tall leaders in the space of AI ethics and philosophy, I consider myself absolutely lucky to be involved and to have the opportunity to have a conversation with all of you. And before I start, a little small introduction about myself. As Professor Narok said, I am a lawyer and I've done a little bit of work on technology policy over the past couple of years in India, and also on areas related to a little bit on intellectual property rights. And again, I say this so that I can present to you probably the biases that I have as a lawyer. So maybe my understanding of ethics and my perspective on ethics in itself would be from the way that possibly I try to distance myself as much as I can from looking at it as a staunch lawyer, but possibly it will have those biases. So you could please excuse me for that. And again, and for me, this is more about learning and understanding how together things can be changed for the better. And through this conversation, what I'm trying to do is look at the specific aspect of algorithms in AI ethics. So I'll definitely get to that. And like Professor Narok said, I'll definitely touch upon a little bit of how we can look at it from the feminist perspective as well. So if somebody can let me know if you can see my screen. I'm not a big fan of PPTs per se, but I think this helps.
We see your screen. That's perfect. Thank you so much.
Great. So, let me, again, this might be a very boring presentation to look at. I'm very sorry. I'm not a big fan of PowerPoint presentations, but here we go. So broadly, what I'm trying to talk or understand more perspectives about, I think that's the better way of framing it, understand more perspective about from this very august gathering is how we can look at algorithms in the broader space of AI ethics conversations, and how algorithms do play a role, and how policy making around algorithms and regulation around algorithms have an impact in the space of AI ethics. So this is what I would generally want to go over, is the around 30 minutes that I have. So how I first want to look at how AI ethics has really mainstreamed over the past couple of years, and then move on to why I like to think about algorithms a little more than I would think about AI ethics as a broader picture. And then move on to looking at that very importance of algorithms in the conversations that we have about AI ethics. And then look at the specific details about innovation how innovation at the level of algorithms impact our understanding and analysis of AI and AI ethics. Again, policy making, as well as finally on algorithmic regulation, which is where I think most of my work that I've done comes within, because as I said, it's the law that I've dealt with more, the law and policy documents that I've dealt with more. So I'm not going to bore you more with the details, but I'll jump into it. So this is something I came across very recently on Twitter. I don't remember from where, but I went I found it very interesting, and I went a little deep to understand how Squarespace, so for the uninitiated, if there are any here, I doubt it. So Squarespace is a platform for website, for creating websites, which is like WordPress, where you can have templates. So this is one such template, and that template is of a user who is an AI ethicist. So generally, if you look at templates for websites, the most out there options that you can see are either digital marketing agencies, or say, obviously digital, in the digital space, people who are providing services in the digital space. But this is one of the most popular templates that Squarespace has, which itself talks about how AI ethics as a space has mainstreamed so much, and why probably the people who are here in this room or the people who will later refer to the recording of this session as practitioners of AI ethics, as researchers, as thought leaders, as philosophers who think about technology and how it functions, how that space has really grown, and that it has become so important that it has become very relevant to the industry. So thinking about that, if we go back a few steps, a few decades, in fact, so when we talk about Marvin Minsky, obviously Marvin Minsky is the name that comes up when you talk about AI, rather called as the father of artificial intelligence. And when we try to locate how ethics has moved from Marvin Minsky to Elon Musk, I picked Elon Musk because that is the rage right now. He seems to be everywhere trying to talk about everything and anything that is related to technology. So Marvin Minsky's story, when we sort of read about how Marvin Minsky thought about artificial intelligence, he probably did not think about sentient, extremely sentient beings and machines. The idea was simply about how you create things that are more efficient, that bring in more value in the prism of having, within the corners of computing. So Marvin Minsky's story is very interesting, by the way, where the people he used to regularly talk to, or the people he used to interact with, and his MIT, the lab at MIT itself, this is a place where ethics, or what happened, what are the second order effects or the third order effects of what they built or what they're trying to build, that was not what was the driving force for any of these developments. Rather, it was about the whole idea of Bassard talks about in Artificial Intelligence, Artificial Unintelligence, a very, very interesting book. She talks about how hacking was the essence of how the idea of artificial intelligence was propelled by Marvin Minsky, where the people he used to recruit into his lab were essentially of the case that they used to really, in the New York subway system, those were the people who would try and punch in all the holes and get to all the subway stops that are there within the space, within the least amount of time. So these are people who are essentially trying to win over things rather than look at second order and third order effects. And this sort of thought that Marvin Minsky is propelled, and much of artificial intelligence related papers or developments go back to Marvin Minsky at one point or the other. So we look at move fast and break things. Obviously, most of you would be familiar was what the internal motto of Facebook was. This is something that Mark Zuckerberg is said to have been living by. But now my guess is that they don't want to move fast and break things because they're quite aware of a lot of things that they have broken in the society. So, but this sort of approach towards technology does continue, and that is something we see. I'm coming back to Elon Musk. That is something we see in the proclamations of freedom of speech and expression that Elon Musk seems to be very interested in on Twitter, on Twitter as a platform. So when we encounter it so appears that they fail to understand that there are different effects, that different steps that corporations, let's just call them institutions, right? So these are, for the ease of understanding, I'm calling them institutions because these are places of power which can take actions that can have effects on a large number of people. I'm calling them institutions for this very narrow reason for this particular talk from that perspective. So when Elon Musk talks about we will abide by freedom of speech and expression, Elon Musk doesn't differentiate between what freedom of speech and expression means in his limited context, or even means beyond the contours of the American Constitution and American law. Because what freedom of speech and expression means in India is nowhere near what freedom of speech and expression means in France or in Brazil or in Thailand or in South Africa. So this lack of understanding and this lack of acknowledgement of this fact, plus the move fast and break things attitude, has really hampered a lot of us and our societies and our ability to think about change. It's what I have observed. And the next thing, again, connecting this back to the idea of algorithms that I want to talk about, is how the evolution of pace of deployment of technology has changed. So if you look at AI in itself, what was called as AI in itself, the deployment of that technology used to be within the research labs, and it used to be, and I'll pick I'm hoping a very relatable example of the pharmaceutical industry. Right? So when you are using, and it's a high-tech industry, pharmaceutical is a high-tech industry, and AI obviously right now is a high-tech industry, which I hope makes sense for both of them to be compared. So when you try and look at the pharmaceutical industry, the way it is deployed, the tech, the way it's tested over people over larger numbers and then further larger numbers, and how that conversation happens and how that development happens, there are more checks and balances. And that is very similar to how most civic tech used to be developed as well. That evolution over smaller and increasing the number of people over whom the tests happen and understanding what the effects are, that seems to have slowed down over the past few years. Again, a quick example is the pandemic, right? So during the pandemic, the speed with which our vaccines were developed, the news wasn't as tight as it otherwise would have been. But for technology in general, algorithms for that matter, the news probably isn't really there either. Except for very, very limited situations, the news probably isn't there either. Why I say this is because, again, let's come back to social media platforms. We are in the lab if we are using social media platforms. When it comes to algorithms, constant A/B testing, it's on us. And yes, it has its pluses and minuses, but how we got to a point where ethical considerations for a good number of time was subservient to the very interesting, happy minds of technologists and creators. Let me call them creators, not technologists, because it's not just technologists that are now involved in the creation of any sort of technology. I'd probably group them under creators because there are more actors involved. So within this deployment of technology, in that space of deployment of technology, ethics and ethicists have become a norm in the industry. And that, I think, is a very welcome change. So if we look at UX designers, and it's a very booming industry, as I said in the previous slide that I showed. It is a space where people need ethicists because there are mistakes that have to be corrected, mistakes that were made over the past decade or decade and a half has to be corrected. And it is on, while it was on the coders and the programmers for vocalizing the tyranny of code, because at the end of the day, those are the people who understood within their limited capacities, because even they could not understand the extent of how codes, particularly the ones run with continuous feedback loops, how they perceived or how they were interacting with users, they were interacting with others who interacted with the service or the product they're giving. The people who understood that. So for vocalizing against the tyranny of the code, I think somebody's for vocalizing the tyranny of code, it's really necessary that not just technologists and creators, but also a larger number of people understand how AI or algorithms particularly is important, and how we communicate and develop them through communication and public engagement. And vocalizing against this tyranny of the code, I think, is where understanding algorithms becomes very important. So why do I talk about algorithms more than taking the broader perspective of AI in itself? That comes down to what I call the veil of vagueness. The veil of vagueness is essentially that after the two AI winters, right now the AI boom that we are seeing, it is really tightly bound with a lot of vague concepts. So anything from your Elisa, from something as simple as a chatbot, today people will market it as AI. So for a lay person who wants to understand what is going on, there is this sort of false divinity that is created where you cannot question, you do not understand what is it that you have to question when there is an algorithmic decision that is made. There is what is very interestingly, Kathy O'Neill in Weapons of Math Destruction calls it algorithmic gods, that you have to submit to the algorithmic gods so that you understand, even if you try to understand what's happening, it's like that divine concept of God that we have. At one point, we cannot question it further, which when it comes to civic issues, when it comes to issues of personal liberty, is not something at this point that we should be accepting. And we're all very familiar with the fact that general old-fashioned AI, the artificial general intelligence, is nowhere close. So that sentient being or thing that, this fear that people have about having artificial intelligence agents who are smarter than people, I fail to understand how they are smarter than people in anything beyond understanding patterns. And human beings are not just about patterns. Like, I think mathematically modeling human beings to the extent that reducing them into patterns is something, I think in Meredith Whittaker's paper, she probably talks about how the military complex and research was taken over by all of tech research was taken over by the military complex. And then that sort of developed into only mathematical modeling and understanding. And that also, it also happened alongside the whole behavioral economics and behavioral science studies movement. So where we've gotten sort of tied into the sort of perspective that these are agents that will become super smart and human beings will not be able to do anything. We've seen ridiculous examples of it being otherwise. So I think something very interesting that I came across is how I saw somebody say that they had saved their friend's name as Andy L, and they'd asked Siri to call Andy L, and Siri had responded saying, yes, calling Andy the 50th, because L in Roman numerals is 50. So this is the extent of smart beings that we are trying to talk about. This is the extent of AI that we are talking about. So I think at this point that it is important to get rid of that divinity that we afford to AI and see beyond the marketing gimmick of everything being called AI and understand that there are fundamentally different types of algorithms, which are what we are actually dealing with, and we are not dealing with this God beyond that veil. And that is where the misunderstandings within computing, we will be able to understand. And that is where a lot of communication will make it clear that this is no God we are dealing with. This is no supreme power that we are dealing with, but this is just something a bunch of creators have created. And once we engage more with it and engage with it critically, we will be able to make it work for us and not fear that it will make us work for it. So there I will move on to why algorithms is specifically important in ethics conversations. So as I said, AI washing is something, I mean, I'd like to call AI washing happens a lot. And that has inflicted tremendous, I think, injury to the common the public understanding about how we deal with all of these issues. So recently, I think a couple of months back, Georgetown Privacy Center, Erin Tucker, I guess that is the professor's name, they came out with a decision of not calling any of their work AI, that them being specific, that it will be more interesting and more important to specify what you're talking about when you're talking about a particular question related to AI. So if you're using broader terms, and there is where the English language and communication plays a very important role in talking about how it is not necessarily that this one grand entity that you're talking about, but you're talking about a specific application, and that specificity of anything that we are working with, particularly because it comes with technology. And as I said, it's deployed at a pace that we are not very used to. It's deployment of tech in real life at this pace, I believe, is not something we as the human race are used to. And we have previously had instances where we've moved into things slowly, but this is not something. So that specificity can bring back that sort of control and understanding. And even further moving within the broader ambit of ethics conversations, when you finally get into the nitty-gritties of understanding that there are different types of algorithms, and it is within these algorithms that we are asking for transparency, within these algorithms that we are asking for ethical applications to work around, we see that we are asking for transparency not from AI entire models, but we are asking for transparency within the algorithms that are used, which are the smaller building blocks of this grand entity that we are provided with. And when we ask for transparency, that sort of accountability is difficult to get because of corporations and because of entities which come out with their own defenses about how that would be infringing on their intellectual property rights, and how then it becomes a question of anti-fairness. Then it becomes a fight over what fairness is, because is fairness about having the economic entity or the institution or the corporation which develops these models and sells it as AI? Is it about us thinking about the economic repercussions of that, or the intellectual repercussions of that, right? So as a programmer, maybe I'm super interested, and it might be my dream project to have a particular kind of mathematical model, and it might employ machine learning techniques, and it might end up developing into what is today called as an AI system, an AI agent. And if that agent, that might be as a programmer, that might be my dream, but do we place that and the fairness, the treatment that we give to that particular person, do we place that in the same space as the treatment we give to the numerous people who have to suffer the second and third order effects, positive or negative, of such entities, of such agents? And finally, human agency in the system. So for a lot of questions that we have, the answer that we probably are seeing right now is about human in the loop systems for AI, so that we have explainability, etc. So there, it's algorithms that we have to bring down the conversation to, rather than the divine model. And even if we are having the broader conversation of AI ethics in itself, we should be getting down to understanding AI as something that is built of data and algorithms. So we see a lot of critical engagement with data ethics. So there is the whole perspective of data feminism. There is a whole perspective of Afro-feminist perspectives on data. There is the global South feminist perspective of looking at data. So that looks at data collection, processing, maintaining, how they are retained. All of these aspects are looked at when it comes to data. And that has been happening for quite some time now. And I think it's high time that we have such critical thinking on algorithms themselves. So we get down to the brass tacks of what AI is built of, and that we have ethical conversations, critical ethical conversations about these things that AI is built of, then move on to addressing that divine entity. So when I talk about, I'll sort of, I think you can just tell me if I'm running out of time. So when I talk about innovation at the level of algorithms, and I think that is where and why we should have ethics conversations on algorithms, because most of our conversations on AI ethics right now, a lot of that conversation, a lot of public popular conversation flows back to explainability of AI. We are terrified of that black box. We don't know what's happening. So we want explainability, and that is a very reasonable ask for as people who are affected by AI decisions. So, but when we look at it solely from the perspective of explainability, we also sort of miss out on the fact that these are constantly evolving feedback systems, which broadly, again, that's something, that's a definition that we talk about, that we see when we ask questions to people who are the creators of AI systems, that these are constantly evolving feedback systems. We can't always tell you what is happening, but at that point, to understand what is happening out of these constantly evolving feedback systems is where we will need to understand algorithms more. And that is where we bring in the aspect of agency, the aspect of human agency within algorithmic systems. It also comes down to the fact that, there are broader ethical questions of whether we should have algorithmic decision making in certain spaces. For example, should there be drones used right now in the conflict that is happening between Russia and Ukraine? Those are decisions, those are meta level decisions that people and institutions have to take. And there should be space for that agency also. And for that agency to actually matter, it will be necessary that explainability and understanding of the feedback systems is a critical component of the conversation that we are having. And that, again, comes down to communication and critical engagement. So me as a layperson, I do not understand if you tell me, oh, Twitter feed just showed me this. Tell me how it shows me this. The ability to break it down, my guess is that this might sound very far-fetched, but the ability to break it down and for us to not have that stratification of people who are extremely well-versed with technology vis-a-vis the larger number who are not, that stratification, if that reduces, that in itself can bring in a lot of innovation at the level of algorithms. Because I think of it as that story about how a multi-million, a project or a model which ran into multiple millions was created to ensure that a toothpaste or a soap package industry, they did not have empty cartons shipped out, but all they needed was a ceiling fan or was a hand fan, so that the empty packets could just fly away. And this was the smartness of a random line worker in the industry. So that sort of understanding of what and how the process works brings in critical engagement. And that is where communication can bring in new ideas, can bring in new solutions, even within algorithmic systems and for decisions that are outside of algorithmic systems. Further on policy making on algorithms. So once all of these conversations, all of these things that I've spoken about mostly deals with how the creators of algorithmic systems should be dealing with AI and the ethics aspects that comes within. But policy making on algorithms, on the other hand, is what institutions, which includes our national governments, our state governments, our international bodies, how they should be looking at algorithms so that mainstreaming of ethics continues. And mainstreaming of ethics is in such a way that it balances. It is for the social good, as this consortium talks about. It is for the social good. So I think, to me, some options that come up as very relevant is about how public funding for innovation in ethical innovation for algorithms is something that can be done. Recently, I happened to work a little bit on platform cooperativism, and I was I was very interested in understanding that in Germany, there are a bunch of policy proposals and there are a bunch of policy measures that the Berlin local government has taken, where funding through various policies, funding is granted to smaller organizations, to organizations which work on social good, etc. It is not limited to profit and non-profit related activities. And I think, and my assumption is that it's the same with France as well. There is a similar laws in place in France as well about how public funding and that sort of public funding for innovation in algorithm is very important, because right now the industrial complex on algorithms, the military complex on algorithms, these are two spaces that are very, very closely connected. So you talk about how the Microsofts and the alphabets are closely connected to the US government, the military side of the US government. But we don't probably see as much close connection on civic tech related engagements with public funded universities there. And my guess is it's a very similar story across the globe. I do understand that EU is trying to do a lot better in that space. But at this point, it's pretty important that this public funding for innovation in algorithmic innovation comes through so that we can have alternatives that work better. And there, another step that we can take is on open sourcing and open auditing of algorithms. So when you open source these things, then you as EU probably have the funds to create very workable, innovative, ethically sound algorithms and make algorithmic decisions and have algorithmic decision-making agents that can consider multiple points and take better decisions, which are not at least as harmful as some of the others. Once you open source that, the benefits of that come to places where we do not have as much money to fund. And that is so supremely important, because at the end of the day, what we have seen in tech for a long time is that the marginalized keep getting marginalized. And those are the people who take the brunt of tech and development. And that is where I think the idea that internet and cyberspace and tech has made the world closer and has made that the whole globalization thing of the global village. I pretty much think that it's a very, very real metaphor. And for that global village to really work, it is necessary that open sourcing of innovation happens, that technology transfer happens. And this can work better with open auditing. What do I mean by open auditing? Social audits where technology, algorithmic decision-making happens in situations where algorithmic decision-making happens. A social audit that is conducted in India might not be the same, might not give you the same results as a social audit conducted in France. So when you have made decisions for open sourcing, also make decisions, make it a palatable solution that we have open auditing in different situations and in different contexts, so that the ultimate result of social good actually happens out of this. And finally, again, I would go back to the example I quoted about the conflict in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia. If Russia is deciding to use algorithmic systems, algorithmic decision-making is being used in a situation where a human probably is not in the loop, should that be an acceptable practice, or should that be derided and decried? As global institutions, I think places like the UN, there is WTO, the UN, there is UNESCO, there are spaces that can provide ample amount of, if not anything else, it is lobbying. If not anything else, if you can have that conversation, if you can allow for human beings to make decisions, because these are highly, highly nuanced conversations. These are very important conversations, and these are extremely nuanced decisions to make. This type of policy making discussions need to happen, and they should be based on the understanding of what algorithms are doing, rather than this divine AI sort of approach that we have. And we've seen that in how it can make things better, in how the New York City Council, in the case of hiring discrimination cases where algorithmic hiring was discriminating against people of color, against women of color, against people who were from the lower incomes part of the society. We've seen that while it was not the most successful of attempts, that conversation really brought out a lot of critical engagement with algorithms. The same happens with the UNESCO draft recommendation on the ethics of AI. The draft was adopted, I think, in November last year. The engagement that happens in that document, it has moved one step beyond the divinity concept of AI that I've been talking about. And that is extremely important, because the absence of that is something that we have seen in India, and I think is not something that should be acceptable. So the use of facial recognition technology in various parts of the country, including the civil aviation, how the civil aviation department has allowed for facial recognition based technology to be used in airports, how there are misgivings that have happened, how there are people who are getting harmed by it. These are not questions and thoughts, and the answer, if we question these systems, ends at that divine point of, oh, but this is what the system said. So you need to move beyond, this is what the system said. You need to understand what this algorithm is doing, and it's not a divine system that is giving you prophecies. And finally, I think why algorithmic regulation matters is because, as a lawyer, again, from when I look at things from my perspective, I have seen that regulation in the national and international level, more often than not, is a concrete expression of ethics. So again, when you go back to making laws, when you go back to the discussions about making laws, it comes back to philosophy. You discuss about Hegelian methods of looking at things, or what Kant would have done, and how your labor, you go about things within philosophical discussions, and then jurisprudence, of course, is filled with these conversations. So it is a manifestation, regulation is a manifestation of ethics. And if algorithms are making decisions for you, and if it has to follow some sort of ethical principles, I think regulation is a very good way of making it do that. And which I have seen differences in China's Internet Information Service algorithmic recommendation management provisions. So this is basically China's recent, about 6 months back, China came out with their draft, and now it's an applicable law where recommendation systems used across services, that includes gig work, that includes trading platform, that includes social media platforms, across systems. If you're using a recommendation system, a recommendation algorithm, again, they do not call it AI, which I think is fantastic. It is a recommendation system, it's a recommendation algorithm, it's a type of algorithm, and that has been correctly identified. And once they have identified that as what is the subject of that law, they look at different ways of tackling that. And there they talk about explainability. There are obviously offenses identified on how, if there are mistakes made, or if their algorithmic decision making is not right, if there is no auditing, on all these aspects, the flaws have been identified, and they're trying to rectify it. Obviously, there are flaws within that law as well. The authoritarian aspects of Chinese regulation, or the Chinese model of looking at the society, remains there. But outside, if we can sever that part of it aside, you see that set of rules tries to bring in what a lot of ethicists have been asking for. So if you're an ethicist working on gig work, if you're a researcher working on gig work, you've been constantly asking about how a person, of what the basis of one person getting a gig to drive a customer from A point to B point is. Why is it choosing that person over the second person who has already driven 24 out of the 25 rides that he has to complete for that extra 200, say, rupees of incentive? That is a question you might have been asking about gig work as a researcher. The same thing about if you're a researcher, if you're researching on social media and freedom of speech, etc., you will constantly be thinking about how amplification is a problem and why is X amplified more than Y. And that those questions, this set of rules has tried to engage with, at least. And we also see very similar attempts with the proposed AI Act in EU. And that again, there are obviously all of these laws have a lot of flaws. I'm not saying they do not have flaws. But what I do believe is that regulation provides a platform for more people to engage so that there is public disclosure. So if I am, at least in the Indian context, I can say, and I think it's true for the South African context as well. So if you're going to have a new law or a new regulation in place, there is this policy called the pre-legislative consultation policy, by which the government is mandated to present the proposed draft to the public so that they can understand and engage with it before it is made into a law. And that helps a lot because it makes that public discourse, it churns that public discourse and it makes it running. And if things like, and if regulation happens, it opens those doors to a larger number of people as against the very small set of creators who create these technologies, who take decisions, and the very few people in power who take decisions, as against having a larger number of people interacting with it. A very fine example of that is financial markets. So when you look at use of algorithmic agents in financial markets, in most countries, it is the central banks have clearly regulated them because one, it has direct effects on the economy, on the financial market, which obviously seems to be the bigger thing that we look at rather than how things impact the society. When it comes to the financial side of it, we seem to be more careful and we seem to understand that it's more vulnerable and it has more effects rather than the long-term effects things can have on society. So within high frequency trading, because through algorithmic systems is something that we've seen as most countries regulating strictly against. So that is an example how that ethic of having, honest trading happening on the financial system that has manifested through regulation. And I think there's a lot of space for algorithmic regulation to create tangible ethics in other spaces as well, so that we do not have this the long-term societal impacts of algorithmic systems or technology in general. We do not have to wait out for that for a very long time. And I think this would be the perfect space for me to sort of ask about what you all think about it and how you all see algorithmic decision-making and algorithms in general, and what you think about how algorithms can, or whether algorithms should be picking and choosing, or whether we should be talking about AI at large, or whether we should be understanding algorithms better and trying to get into the nuance of algorithms before we look at this divine entity called AI. That's about it from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was really a very inspiring talk, and I am sure there are a lot of discussions, so maybe I will take the questions, and if there's some more time at the end, I will have a few questions myself. Thank you so much. So there's a first question. So maybe I will ask you to ask yourself your questions if you can. And first to introduce yourself. So I see there is a first question from Abdul Wahid Khan. Mr. Khan, can you speak or should I read your question? If you can speak, please ask your question, and if you can't, I will read it.
Yes, sure. So, hi Sapni, thank you very much for the insightful talk. I'm currently doing my PhD, and my topic is AI and AI in marketing, and specifically looking at the consumer behavior. So, I noted that you mentioned that lot of people and lot of regulations are calling it as algorithms instead of AI. So I would like to know more that how do we differentiate between calling algorithm and AI, and in which cases can we call it as algorithm, and do we call it as
Thank you, Abdul, if I can call you that by your first name. I think I'd first like to correct that I was mentioning that a lot of our present understanding looks at it more from the perspective of AI and less from algorithms, while it is changing. And you've asked a very, I think you've hit the nail when it comes to that sort of conflict of understanding between whether something is AI or algorithm is something that I was talking about in the case of, it's a classic question of communication. And when you look at the nitty-gritties of it. So my understanding of it is that in most cases, when you delve deep into the particular model you're talking about, it might just be a feedback enabled algorithmic recommendation system. So if you're talking about in the consumer space, I think my understanding is that in most cases it would be that. And why I say this is because I'd go back to the Georgetown Privacy Center approach, which they take, and how they differentiate between use of AI as a term and why it is necessary instead to look at specific applications. So they delve into history a little bit and talk about the Imitation Game, which is the Alan Turing's very famous Imitation Game, which was the result of the paper. So, but then they very, the professor very interestingly points out that the object of that paper, of that particular paper as an interrogator, is for the interrogator to not be able to say an imitating agent, an imitating computer agent from an actual human being. But while most of the political or the creative sort of understanding of the imitation game, it engages with it as machine intelligence, Turing's paper sort of never answers the question of whether or not the imitation game in itself is equivalent to artificial intelligence, whether that part of sentience or intelligence, where does it come out of imitation. He just explains that he's replacing the question, I think, of can machine think with the question of whether a human can mistake a computer for another human. So what we are essentially looking at is probably not, our popular understanding of Turing's paper is probably not the perspective that we might want to apply when we look at real life use cases. So in your case, I think if you really delve deep enough, I think in most cases it would be algorithms that you're dealing with, and AI would just be, it would just have been an AI washed algorithm rather than, it might be a marketing gimmick because it sells. I mean, let's be honest, that's how the economy works. Whatever sells, you name it that.
Sure. I got the answer. That was very helpful.
Thank you very much for this question. And yes, this answer Do we have other questions, probably? Would you like to raise your hand? Yeah, we have a question, Professor Siva Prasad Madatla. Sorry for my French pronunciation. Please correct me and take the floor.
Thank you. It is a very interesting talk. And you have mentioned two prominent things I felt. One was that the marginalized further get marginalized. And also another thing that you mentioned about is when we are trying to make regulations or acts or any legal frameworks, participation of the public, or put it in the public domain and then participation. In fact, the second one, first one I wanted to ask you is, how can the people who have no access to these resources participate in that decision making? That's one. The second question is, when we are trying to talk about whether it's AI or algorithms that you're talking about, how do we ensure that all these marginalized communities get some kind of a role to play in the decision making or in algorithm making? Because what happens when we are looking at this, because we are looking at the whole thing as if it's a all pervasive kind of a phenomenon. It can't be all pervasive because local context, local situations, local environments all play an important role. When we are talking about even sustainable development, local systems play important role. So in this context, how do you look at to find a solution for inclusivity of the marginalized, including in the decision making, apart from including in the legal framework kind of design? Thank you.
Thank you. I think your second question, I think I tried to answer it when I was talking about social audits. When I was talking about how different contexts, in different contexts, the results would be different. So if at the point of access, if you have to clear things up, if you have to get more people in, it is not something a law can do. It's something, it is social change. And I think, you all are much more experienced in that space than I am when I talk about social change. So if that social change has to happen, I think a small anecdote I would talk about is the India AI project. There is something called Ind AI, where it's a collaboration between NASSCOM and the Ministry of External Affairs in India, the MeitY, the Ministry of Information Technology in India, where there are people working in that organization in India who are reaching out to extremely remote parts of the country, going to schools, going to children and talking about what these things are, how they can have more opportunities in these areas, and how there are repercussions of these systems that are put into place that they should be aware of, and making them aware of what these things are about. So those are actually, these are things that individuals are doing. These are not things the institution is of course doing. But when you create that sort of an environment, I think things can change for inclusion better, rather than us putting a top-down approach of trying to get things sorted. So that was your second question. Your first question was about how, without access, how people will engage with it. And an example, I think there is more possibility of people engaging with these issues if it becomes a regulatory problem, rather than a decision that creators themselves take. I think so, from my personal observations, because when it becomes a very interesting example, I would say, is during the initial parts of the pandemic. And this is not an algorithm, it is not an example of algorithms, it's something on data. Something I did see, I observed, is about how during the initial part of the pandemic in Kerala, there was a dashboard that was used and where the government had contracted with this organization. I forget the name. It's a Canadian, or it's a US Canadian organization. And the government seemed to have had no proper contracts. The government seemed to have no proper data processing related limitations that were put into that contract, which became a huge cause for huge hue and cry in Kerala. And I think while people were not actively aware of data rights, we do not have a data protection law in India. It was not the law that helped them. It is that engagement, it is when those conversations happen within your local government bodies, within your state legislative bodies, people naturally tend to get more interested in this. And that is something I think I see from our cultural context in India. I'm not very sure if that happens in places outside India. But when it becomes a matter of politics, which it seems to only happen when it comes to loud shouting people on the TV or loud shouting people in parliaments and legislatures. When it comes to that, I think more people get interested, and because of that, more people, that awareness spreads better. And I think that is why regulation can be a good manifestation of ethics into our society.
Okay, thank you. I think we can talk it over later, because the point is, even social audits, we know the way how the social audits are done. Because we are seeing in the case of the what we call the kind of way in which the monies are spent on developmental projects. Social audits are sometimes just a facade rather than the real kind of thing. But I think the process has to be there somewhere.
It's about having those institutional checks and balances, which you can always work on better, rather than not having anything.
I agree with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have other questions? Waiting a bit. Yeah, there's one. Emma, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry, I have to apologize that my camera doesn't want to listen to me today. It's really very rude, and I'm sorry about that. I hope that I will be able to join you in a more interactive way next time. So yeah, I want to ask you, maybe because I ask specific questions about machine learning algorithms, let me just, on the previous question, just say that what I mean, I think there is a difference between classical algorithms that solve problems via given sets of rules, where machine learning algorithms are adaptable. The logic of machine learning systems change the way in which algorithms solve problems. So the way in which the problems are solved are not predetermined. So in this sense, not all algorithms are AI driven, but we are concerned about the ones that are, because of this issue of adaptability. So my question is, should we use machine learning algorithms to inform, execute, or drive decisions to the level of, speaking of algocracy, where humans are reduced to data subjects and algorithms constrain, influence, and structure human behavior? So if we say no, how do we retain the good that AI algorithms can bring to humankind? Because there is good that it can bring to humankind. So, you know, how do we just say no, or do we try to find a middle way? It's a bit of a complex, you know, this is a very wide question. So you're welcome to answer it in any context. If you want to, you know, I mean, the whole issue of social justice just makes it so much harder to answer this question, because maybe there isn't just one answer. It depends on which continent you are. But over to you. Sapni, thank you so much for a very interesting talk.
I think you answered the question pretty much very well yourself when you said it's very, very contextual. And it's contextual on multiple levels. That it is contextual on geographies, it's contextual on economic realities, it is contextual on technological realities in different continents, in different places. So I don't think that we should throw the baby and the water and the tub together outside. I don't think it would be useful for us to do that at this point, because if we actually ban things, if that's the way we are looking at it, that's never worked. A ban is definitely not going to work. Things are only going to get worse in the shady, or rather black market of things, of issues. So I think at this point, it would be more practical for us to engage critically with this question of how do we not slip into that slippery slope of algocracy, because that we do see that already, right? So when we talk about, I mean, the example I can think of is, again, social media, where algorithms have started sort of dictating how content creators speak, what they show, what they present to the world. And I would say that is the slippery slope of algocracy that we are moving in, and where algorithms constrain even the very idea of creativity. So that is a very real threat that we have, a very real concern that all of us should have. But my belief is that if we sort of ban and there is no way this is going to go away right now. If you ban it, nobody's going to stop doing this. People are going to do this in their backyards. People are going to do this in their storerooms, and people will create things that might be monsters that we have not even thought of because we said, oh, we just banned it. So I think critical engagement is the way forward, rather than a ban, or rather than completely thinking that we can get rid of it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this interesting question and answer. We have another question from Cordon Green. Could you please introduce yourself and ask your question? Thank you.
Is it just me? I cannot hear them.
Are you
No, we
hearing
don't
me?
hear anything. Yeah, now I think it's good.
Are you hearing me?
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Right, yes. I was saying that I agree with your general point that we should not ascribe divinity to AI algorithms, but I wonder if there's a risk of underestimating the impact of AI anthropomorphism and the real intent of influential AI innovators who adhere to transhumanism.
I get that. I mean, I do quite wonder about this myself, often because I happened to come across a group which was already advocating for robot rights. There happens to be a group already who advocate very actively for robo rights and intelligence rights rather than human rights. But my belief is that if we sort of narrow down and try to make these conversations more nuanced when we look at it from the perspective of algorithms, I think there are more questions presented to these creators, the influential creators who make these algorithms. There are more questions, and there are more nuance to the questions we present to them as well. So that, I think, buys us time and creates communication and helps in us as a community decide whether this is something that we want to continue to engage with, which is why I think while you do have the AI conversation happening of that quote unquote divine sort of transhuman model happening, but it's also, I think it is very, very relevant to have the conversation at the level of algorithms, because my understanding is that, at least the way I have seen it through how I've tried to understand AI, my understanding at least has become sharper. My engagement has, I believe, become more nuanced when I started looking at beneath the hood. So that's currently my perspective on this, and I'm totally open to change. And there is incredible, I'm sure, incredible amount of literature and thought that's happening on this. And yeah, so I'm currently, this is how I feel about it. But I think things, obviously, nothing is static. It's a very dynamic.
Thank you very much. I think we have another question from our organizer, Professor Rao.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for your wonderful presentation. And just I would like to know your idea on, since most of the countries have come up with AI policies, but except China, as far as my knowledge goes, no country has a policy on algorithms. And as all of us know that the AI is being controlled from at the level of algorithm itself. So do you suggest now that it would be better if majority of the countries will come up, those who are actively using AI will come up with a policy on algorithms, number one. Number two, do you also suggest that it is the time for UNESCO to take up this job, in the sense that since UNESCO has AI ethics recommendations, maybe UNESCO will also focus on algorithm recommendations for AI?
I'll answer the second question first. I think it is important for multilateral and transnational organizations like the UNESCO to get into these brass tacks. And I think it would be more beneficial for us as the global community if we have cutting-edge research and smarter thought, which is more nuanced. At least in the case of AI, I think it would be very beneficial if the UNESCO takes a step forward in this direction. On the question of different nations having algorithm policy, I'd rather say that AI in itself is looked at as something, it's an idea. So it's like, it's not a very concrete thing that, at least whatever I have come across in my research and my reading on AI policies, most of these, except for very few military uses, it's an idea that is building. It's not just concrete objectives that nations have, but it has a lot of philosophy and a lot of ideology associated with these AI policies. But algorithms, on the other hand, I think rather than policies, when you look at regulation in itself, I think it would be more useful for countries to look at regulation at the level of algorithm than looking at AI regulation, because even when you look at it at the level of algorithms, there are different kinds of algorithms. And like we engaged with the previous question on ML based on machine learning techniques, algorithms which use machine learning techniques, those are completely different from algorithms which do not use machine learning techniques. And you do not deal with recommendation algorithms the same way you deal with other algorithms. So it's necessary, I think it'll be more beneficial if we look at things with that clarity rather than we have, say, an AI regulation act in India or anywhere else for that matter. having AI policy, I think is good because you have the obvious economic and all of those aspects to it and that ideology to it. But when it comes to regulation, I think I currently feel algorithmic regulation is a better way to go rather than just having, because that's something very important when it comes to laws, that it has to be very clearly defined. You cannot very clearly define AI yet. So I think algorithms will be an easier way to do that.
Very much. Do we have another question?
Let me try to raise my hand.
If you speak, it's okay. Please don't raise your hand and speak. I think it's better. Could you please start to introduce yourself and then ask your question? And I think it will be our last question. Thank you.
Yes, so my name is Alfredo Ronchi. I'm professor at Politecnico di Milano, Italy. So, of course, in the field of ICTs. And I used to work a long time ago on the previous generation of AI. So the question for the speaker is about the misuse or potential misuse of AI and the way to have kind of control of such kind of misuses. For instance, nowadays is very popular, the so-called nudging. So they use artificial intelligence to, let's say, push the, let's say, the behavior or the interest or the attention of the people towards some specific goals, some specific positions. So what do you think about this? Just looking at the dark side, let's say.
I think looking at the dark side is where I would really want ethics manifesting as regulation, because that is where I possibly see a little bit of the dark side becoming a little less dark. So I believe, I mean, again, this comes from me being a lawyer and not being an actual developer who has had experience developing these technologies. So people like that obviously will have a different set of, a completely probably different perspective on it. But I do think that sort of example, the example you gave of nudging, that's probably not something we should be constantly subject to. So we at least, if not having, and that's an example, I think that's a good thing that I'd like to take out of the rules in China that I was talking about, where you have the option to opt out of such mechanisms within the system that you're engaging with. So such steps, I think, are necessary, and I think that would be beneficial.
Okay, thank you. Of course, it's a little bit complicated because sometimes it's even supported by governments, apart from, let's say, the dark side of the population. And the black boxes created by AI are not so easy to be managed. So many times we just look at the outcomes, but we don't know what's inside the box. And that's
it's very clearly, I think, even the specific Chinese regulation I'm talking about, even that the obvious Chinese aspect of that regulation is that regulation emphasizes and re-emphasizes about how what is presented to people are abiding by the social standards and the objectives of the Chinese state, which essentially is nudging. It's nudging by anti-nudging, if I may call it that, because you nudge against people seeing things that might make them think about things. So yeah, I think that's a slippery slope. That's a hard problem that we have to crack. I think that's what it's called in technical terms. It's a hard problem.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Very, very interesting.
Thank you so much. If we don't have any other pressing question, as we are running out of time, I suggest we thank very much our speaker for this very inspiring speech, and also everybody for the discussion, the conversation, which was, I think, very interesting. Let me just, before we finish, ask you to have a look in the chat. We have the announcement for the next talk, which will be on the 26th of July at 5 p.m. India time. So for evening, if you're in the evening, and afternoon, if you're in the afternoon in your own countries, of course. And I also did mention the link if you want to read more about Sapni GK and what she's doing. She's actually co-founder of Robos and of Tech Law and Policy, which is a publishing space focusing on matters related to technology, law, policy, and society. And I think it's really interesting to have a look at the website and to maybe continue the discussion through the website. So thank you all for your attention for the discussion. And now I give back the floor to the organizers, which I think a lot too.
Yes. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Sapni. I am seeing her, as I mentioned, for the first time on the screen virtually. So we haven't met physically yet. I hope that we will meet soon and discuss further on how we can work together. Thank you very much for your wonderful and insightful presentation. I hope that everybody has enjoyed it. I also thank Professor Vanessa Nuro for accepting within a short notice, for accepting to preside over this talk. Thank you, ma'am. I am sure that IRCA and Gain for HG will work together to explore the possibilities of further collaborations and in the area of AI ethics, and we are very much looking forward. And of course, finally, I thank all of you, each and everyone. I see my very close friends here, Professor Alfredo, Gatut, Cardell Green, and Helen, Hezekiel. So because there were 25 participants, and it is very nice. I hope that you have all enjoyed, and let us meet on 26th July at 17 hours India time, and have a nice evening, nice day, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. See you soon.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.